think we'll begin our webinar. Welcome to this International Association of Chiefs of Police webinar on bringing research into police agencies, the Sacramento Hotspots Experiment. This webinar is brought to you by the Research Advisory Committee of the IACP and is a follow-up to the Research and Brief column in Police Chief Magazine on the topic of the hotspot policing study conducted in Sacramento, California. Today our panelists will provide an overview of the study, including results, and discuss how it could serve as a model for other agencies that are interested in conducting research. And I just want to talk about a few things about the webinar service before we begin. In order to access the audio portion of today's webinar, you have two choices. You can either select the computer microphone and speakers as an option or the telephone to access the audio portion. And you can do this by clicking the button on your control panel. If you click the telephone button, please follow the directions to dial in to access the audio portion that way. Also, once you've logged in, you will be in mute only throughout the presentation until we arrive at the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Once we reach the Q&A session at the end, you will have two options to ask questions. You can either ask a question verbally over the phone or your microphone by selecting the hand icon on your control panel. Once you raise your hand, I will then call on individuals and you can ask your question over the phone. You can also submit questions through the questions box on your control panel. I'll be reading questions off from the panel to the panelists directly. So those are your two options once we go into the Q&A. Our two panelists today played a direct role in the completion of the Sacramento Hotspots study. Renee Mitchell has worked for the Sacramento Police Department for the last 15 years and is currently a police sergeant in the Court Liaison Unit. She has a Bachelor of Science in Psychology from the University of California, Davis, a Master's of Arts in Counseling Psychology from the University of San Francisco, an MBA from the California State University, Sacramento, and a JD from the University of the Pacific, McGeorge School of Law, where she was awarded an academic scholarship. She was the 2009-10 Fulbright Police Research Fellow, where she attended the University of Cambridge Police Executive Program and completed research in the area of juvenile gang violence at the London Metropolitan Police Service. Cody Telep is a doctoral student in the Department of Criminology, Law, and Society at George Mason University and a research associate in the Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy. He will be receiving his PhD in May. He received an MA from the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Maryland in 2008. Starting in August, he will be an assistant professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Arizona State University. His research interests include police legitimacy, evaluating innovations in policing, police education, and evidence-based policy. And at this point, I want to welcome our panelists. And Renee, I'll pass it over to you.
Hi. Okay, so to begin, I'm going to go over where we were at in 2010 for the Sacramento Police Department. In the fall of that year, we were starting to look at our budget problem, and we were going to have to potentially lay off 100 officers. And when we were looking at cutting that amount of officers from our organization, at the time we were already down to the high sevens, so we were looking at getting down into 600 officers or so. And the idea was going to be that we're going to cut out our narcotics, our vice, our POP teams, our any kind of specialized service that we didn't need, we were going to try to cut. So we were going to become this patrol-based police department, with patrol being our major services that we were working with. And in order to keep crime and calls for service down, we wanted to figure out an effective and efficient way of doing this. So we started looking at what was out there, what models we could use, and we came up with using the Cooper curve. And this was through talks with Cynthia Lum at George Mason and David Weisberg, and going over our problem at SACPD, because we really wanted to focus on what we needed to do and how to make us, like I said, a more effective and more efficient police department in patrol. And then we talked about what outcomes do we want to measure. We wanted to figure out how to do a really good evaluation rather than implementing a program and not having a rigorous evaluation of that, doing a a causal analysis, I guess you would say. So instead of doing what we normally do, which is implement a program, you see crime go down, and then you say, oh, you know, it must have been our program, we actually wanted to do a randomized controlled trial where we assigned certain areas to treatment and certain areas to control, and then tested to see if our treatment of 15-minute high visibility intermittent random patrol would reduce crime and calls for service. So that's kind of the layout of where we were at and how we started, our thought process of how we started down the road of developing this idea with George Mason.
I wanted to talk a little bit about what researchers can do to be helpful to agencies in dealing with some of the problems they're facing. So one thing the researchers can do is to provide information on the research, evidence, how research can be integrated into practice, and then how researcher-practitioner partnerships can be beneficial and successful. So I wanted to point to some resources that we put together at George Mason and that the federal government has put together that can be really beneficial, we hope, in informing agencies about some of these issues. So the first is the Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy, where I work. Our website overall has a lot of resources for agencies. We have one-page research summaries that describe a number of big studies in policing. We have a large video library that includes videos from researchers and practitioners at some of our events talking about issues of police partnership and police research. We have a number of symposia throughout the year that I'll mention a little bit later, focused on issues in evidence-based policing. And another large tool we have on our website is the Evidence-Based Policing Matrix that I'll actually pull up and show you all. It's a little easier to see. First of all, to mention here, this is our center's website. As you can see, we just have a lot of resources. We have a whole evidence-based policing research program that really focuses on issues in policing. We also have, as I mentioned, these one-page briefs, one-page summaries of research. We have a magazine called Translational Criminology. It's really focused on how some of these police and research partnerships have worked in practice and how we can kind of move forward with evidence-based policing. If I really wanted to pull up the Matrix website, it's a lot easier, I think, to see than just hear about. And so here's the home page for the Evidence-Based Policing Matrix. And the idea of the Matrix is to provide a research practice translation tool. So our goal here was to think of a way we could visually display higher quality research that's been done in policing to help agencies, policymakers, draw generalizations on what is effective in policing. And so what you see here is our three-dimensional diagram, and each of these dots represents a single study that was done and evaluated rigorously. And so these dot colors represent whether the study results were effective or not in reducing crime and disorder. So black dots are effective studies. These gray dots represent mixed results with some beneficial findings, but also some of the outcomes not show crime control reductions. The white dots indicate studies where the results were not significant, so there was really no effect on crime. And then these red triangles indicate instances where actually there was a significant impact that was in the opposite direction of what we want. So a backfire effect where crime or whatever outcome was measured actually went up. So the goal here, though, is not just to focus on the individual studies, but you can see how these studies cluster based on how we've coded them. And so in the matrix, we code them, these studies, on three different dimensions. There's three different axes. So the x-axis on the bottom here is the geographic unit of analysis. So whether the study is focusing in on individuals, say, or on groups, which is often gangs. And then we have different levels of place. So micro places might think of a single street segment hotspot, or up to larger units like neighborhoods or even an entire jurisdiction. Now on the y-axis, we look at whether the study is focusing on more general approach to crime prevention, or to really focus on a specific mechanism or specific way the crime might be occurring. And then we also, and that the y-axis is along here, and we also have the z-axis that looks at how proactive the study is. So whether it's just reactive in terms of the response is occurring just after a crime has already happened, or whether it's something you can think about levels of proactivity. So something might be thinking about trying to prevent crime, and you can also have highly proactive studies. You're really aimed at trying to change the dynamics in the situation to prevent crime in the long term. And so just an example of what the matrix can help you do. I mean, in terms of the clustering, you can see here where certain areas where a lot of successful studies are clustering. So one being up here, the microplace studies that are highly proactive and focused up here at the top. You can see a number of successful studies. And these are largely hotspots policing studies that are often focused on problem-oriented policing. So the matrix allows you to draw these generalizations that focusing in on small units of geography, being highly proactive and focused seems to be successful. And you can also click on an individual study. If you're interested in knowing what actual studies make up these dots, you can hover above a study, you're able to see a little bit about the study, and you can click on any dot, and you see here, it pulls up a page here where you can learn a bit about the study, find out the reference if you want to try to find the original study. So matrix sort of allows you to both narrow in on individual research studies and learn more about them, but also generalize more. So we have what we call realms of effectiveness page. We can sort of see the matrix, which highlighting some of the areas that there seem to be more successful studies or less successful studies. So you see the circle there for those hotspot studies we were talking about, but you also see in some of the individual-based studies some of the less successful results. So some of these studies, for example, are studies on DARE, where the evidence isn't very successful that DARE has a major impact on reducing subsequent adolescent drug use. There's a lot of resources on the matrix page, so I encourage you all to explore it if you're interested in learning more about the research. So our goal here was to ensure that agencies and officers interested in learning about research didn't have to sit there and read the over 100 studies that we have in the matrix, but we present it in ways that hopefully make it easier to digest this research and learn a little bit about research without being so overwhelmed by the number of studies. Going back to the slides here, some other research we have related to the matrix is this new matrix demonstration project. This is a project that's been funded by BJA, and the goal here is to take some of the lessons from the matrix and apply those in agencies. So how can we develop tools that help translate and institutionalize research findings into practice? So if you go to the matrix demonstration page, now you can learn about some of the demonstrations we have ongoing. And these are all instances where agencies are trying to think of ways they can institutionalize research into practice. So take something they might have learned from the matrix and how can they apply that to the agency. And there's a number of different demonstrations that we have ongoing now, just to give an example of a few. One will be, this is something we're working on now, is that Renee will actually be putting together a guide on running an experiment in-house. So that should be something that we'll talk a little bit about today, but would be very useful for agencies that are interested in replicating some of what Renee's done in Sacramento. It's kind of a how-to guide and the steps you need to take when thinking about doing an experiment in an agency. We also have some information on academy training and how do we make that more evidence-based. So Cynthia Lum and some of her colleagues have put together a 4-part video training module that discusses evidence-based policing. This could be used in the academy to give new recruits some exposure to the research evidence and what evidence-based policing is and how they can apply it in their day-to-day work. We also have some agencies thinking about how they can better integrate research evidence into field training. So a number of agencies have checklists that recruits, after they finish the academy, things they have to accomplish during field training, and ways we can think about incorporating evidence more into that. So perhaps one part of field training would require officers to go to crime analysis and learn about hotspots, and then apply what they've learned from crime analysis to actually treating some of the hotspots with more police patrol, for example. So the Matrix Demonstration Project, I also encourage you to take a look at, just get a sense of what some agencies have done to date and what some potential ideas are for trying to use research evidence in practice in a number of different areas across departments. And then a final resource on this page is something that, now that we created George Mason, but the Office of Justice Programs and the U.S. Department of Justice has put together a really valuable resource, crimesolutions.gov. So this is a way to get a sense of what the evidence is in a number of different programs. So across criminal justice, juvenile justice, and victim services, they've had experts evaluate the research evidence for a number of different programs. And now about 250 programs, 50 of which are in law enforcement. And so you can go there and search by topic area and get a real sense of what the evidence to date shows on a number of different law enforcement programs. And also, finally, I just want to note that in the next few months, at George Mason, we'll be launching another website related to what we've done with the Matrix that will provide information on what works in policing. So we'll be looking at programs that show evidence of effectiveness, like hotspots policing, and then programs that are showing less evidence of effectiveness. And also we'll have resources and information from prior studies on the best ways to implement some of these effective approaches. So that'll be something that we hope will also be useful that we'll be coming out with in the next few months. I'll turn it back over to Renee.
So back to what Cody was talking about with the partnership, I have up there Cosmopolites and Serendipity, because this was all serendipitous how this came about. But with the Cosmopolites, that's just going outside of your area of expertise and looking at different departments, looking at different ways of doing things. And that's how the partnership between George Mason came about. And just to give a little back history, I had met Jim Bierman, who was the chief of Redlands at the time, at a post meeting, and he had told me about what he was doing in Redlands and all of their innovative stuff and about evidence-based policing. And he began to give me some information on what research is out there, what shows to be effective or not effective in policing. And he had Cynthia Lum come down to Redlands to do a presentation on evidence-based policing, which I attended. And then after that, I went to the American Society of Criminology conference down in San Francisco, and that's where I met David Weisberg. And through those contacts is how we came up with this idea to test out hotspot policing. Because at the conference when I talked to David, he discussed being Sacramento PD's like a scientific advisor, that if we had questions or we wanted to know information, that he would allow us access to his people. So that's where, if you're looking at trying to create this relationship between your organization and the local university, is think about sending people to conferences or classes outside of your professional circle. Because often as cops, we attend training that has to do exactly with policing, which doesn't diversify our thinking very much. It keeps us in that same frame of mind about the way we approach a problem in policing. So by going outside of our box, in a sense, you could come up with different ideas and different ways of approaching a problem. And then also, like Cody mentioned in the matrix, that you could go on there and you could see the different articles that have been written. You can contact the researchers because they're always at the universities. They always have a public email address on the university website that you could email them, and most of them are more than happy to spend some time with you on the phone to talk about their article, to talk about the theory behind it, and ways to apply it to your organization. And distance doesn't always matter, because we were out here in Sacramento, California, and George Mason's back in Virginia, and we did this all by phone of setting up our research project, talking about the idea, because a lot of it is just critical thinking, thinking about the problem your agency is facing, and then how you want to attack that problem, and then how many resources you have to deal with the issue. And sometimes, I know the sense you get from cops sometimes is that researchers are telling cops how to behave or how to act or how to police, and they've never been cops before. And for me, what I found that that's not really the case is that we have the same goals. Both police departments and universities were trying to solve problems in crime and public policy and our response to our citizens and how we create the best relationship with our citizens and then also keep crime and calls for service down. They have those same goals. They just approach it in a different manner that, you know, we want to drive crime down and we want to drive calls for service down and we want to have a good relationship with our community. Researchers just want to evaluate how we do that. So that way, in the end, what you get is this good product. Because a lot of times we create good programs, but we don't know if they're truly effective. And sometimes we create programs that other police departments take on, and it spreads across the United States before we even know if it's a good program that actually is effective. And it might not be until years later that they get evaluated, and we find that maybe it doesn't meet the needs of our organization the way we thought it would. So that's a way of, to me, getting outside of policing and looking at problems in policing from a different viewpoint, is getting outside of our boxes and becoming cosmopolites.
So I just wanted to build off what Renee is saying, just speak a little bit about what the partnership between Sacramento PD and George Mason looked like in practice. So at the outset, Renee, as she mentioned, started working with David Weisberg and Cynthia Lum and learning more sort of about evidence-based policing and what research evidence had suggested. So, you know, folks at George Mason here at the Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy worked really closely with Renee at the outset to think about, you know, what research question would be appropriate and be realistic for something that the Sacramento PD can take on, and then sort of how you could design intervention and an experiment and evaluation was going to give you a good answer to the question of whether what you were doing was effective. So as Renee had mentioned before, I mean, police agencies don't often do experiments, especially on their own, without outside assistance. And so it was really exciting here to have a police agency thinking about taking on experimental evaluation that really give them good evidence and a good answer to the question of whether or not what they were doing was effective or not in addressing crime. So that sort of consultation at the outset, again, as Renee was saying, that some of it took place in person at conferences and other events, but a lot of it took place over in phone conversations and email conversations. And so sometimes it can be useful, as we'll talk a little bit about more, to have research partners that are right nearby in terms of some of the things we can do. But distance doesn't mean that you can't work together. And so we've worked a lot with Renee now over the last few years, and being on opposite sides of the country, and it's still going well. So again, the CDCT folks are working a lot with Renee at the beginning in terms of how we go about designing the evaluation and how we can come up with a kind of research plan that was realistic. And then as we developed to do this hotspots experiment, Renee and other folks in crime analysis and other folks in the department really oversaw a lot of the interventions. So oversaw selecting the hotspots. Renee and other crime analysts worked on this. And then also during the implementation of the intervention and monitoring the project during the whole 90-day study, Renee was really taking the lead here. So it took a lot of leadership from Renee and other folks in the Sacramento PD to make sure this was a reality. Because of the situation we had in Sacramento, we didn't have any sort of special funding from the federal government or any agency. And so we didn't really have anything in place for researchers to be on site monitoring the study. So it really took a lot of work from Renee and their colleagues to make sure this experiment actually happened. And Renee did a lot during the intervention and the experiment to make sure that the treatment was being delivered as she expected and she wanted, that things were actually happening in a way that afterwards when we evaluated, we could be sure that some sort of intervention had actually been delivered. And then I, in particular, worked a lot with Renee and some of the data from Sacramento PD after the experiment had happened to analyze the effectiveness of the intervention, see what works better than others, and try to understand why we got the results that we did, which, as Renee mentioned, were largely beneficial in showing that the hotspots treatment had some sort of impact on crime in the treatment group hotspots. And so the partnerships, you can see, there were kind of different groups at George Mason and Sacramento taking leadership at different parts of the intervention, but it involved a lot of work from the agency, sort of taking a leadership role and really wanting to do this intervention, and then Renee in particular really overseeing it to make sure that it was done effectively throughout. But these partnerships in universities can be really useful, especially in terms of designing the evaluation technique and then thinking about how to analyze the data afterwards. So just thinking a little bit about what some resources might be for other agencies interested in working on these partnerships and working more closely with perhaps with the university research partners. One resource that we've put together in collaboration with BJA is what we call the E-Consortium of University Centers and Researchers for Partnership with Justice Practitioners. And this, I'll also pull this up so you can take a look, is a really useful database of research centers and researchers in universities nationwide that are interested in working with justice practitioners in policing and then across criminal justice, and so also things like corrections as well. So you can see here that the database is available for you to search. You can search it by geographic location, by state. You can also search it by keyword. So for example, you could type in policing if you're interested in doing police research. And you can see here a list of both research centers and individual researchers who have registered and signed up for the E-Consortium because they're interested in working with different justice agencies and police agencies. And so, as I said, you can also search by geographic area. So if you wanted to see, if you took out the keyword, you can see all the groups in Virginia. But if you wanted to see, for example, all the different groups in Virginia that have signed up for the E-Consortium, you can see here by state as well. As I mentioned, geographic location is everything, but it can be useful at times. So we have to date here is over 100 different researchers and research centers at universities that have signed up for our E-Consortium. And these are really people that are volunteering their services to police agencies and other justice agencies. So if you're interested in kind of creating a partnership and you don't exactly know where to start, this might be a good place to get a sense of the universities that are available and the researchers that are interested in these close partnerships. Another upcoming opportunity for those of you that are in the Washington, D.C. area is our upcoming symposium and congressional briefing. So the Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy is holding a joint symposium and congressional briefing in April with the Scottish Institute for Policing Research, which is an organization in Scotland that's been really focused on advancing evidence-based policing, Scottish Policing Service. And so this event will be happening on Monday, April 8th, and Tuesday, April 9th. The April 8th event will be a symposium at the George Mason University Arlington campus, really focused on issues actually translating research into practice and how evidence-based policing can become more of a reality. So there'll be a number of exciting panels that day and plenaries focused on translational research and building police partnerships. Ben actually will be talking about some of the work IACP has done and small and rural departments. I'll be speaking some about some survey research we've done, trying to get a sense of whether officers are open to doing research. So this will be a really exciting event and also an opportunity to both learn more about what other agencies have done, but also to network with researchers and other agencies in attendance who are interested in these issues of partnership and building evidence-based policing. And then on April 9th, we'll have a congressional briefing that will be in Washington, D.C., and that will be focused on issues of policing, and particularly policing in young people, and so issues of legitimacy and crime reduction and working with juveniles. So this will be a really exciting event for us, so we hope that those of you in the D.C. area will be able to join us. So that's totally free, and if you go to the center's website, you can find out information about registering. I also just want to point out that IACP has a number of resources that are useful for those interested in creating partnerships. So one is a police chief article from June 2009 called Partnership for the University-Based Researchers. It really has a lot of good information on what to do to go about setting up some of these partnerships like we had with Renee in Sacramento. So I'll turn it back over to Renee to talk some more about the actual hotspot study.
And with the hotspot study, just like Cody was saying, as far as my team, my crime analysis team, doing this without any funding, there's quite a few opportunities. There's huge gaps in knowledge when it comes to police research that still need to be explored, that an organization can take and answer those questions. Some research, and Cody, correct me if I'm wrong, some research, if you're going to do surveys, if you're going to do real in-depth stuff, you're going to need some funding because you need staffing to do those types of things. But if you're looking at answering smaller questions for your own organization, or even taking existing research and applying it to your area to see if it translates for your city or for your county, that's possible to do without outside funding. What it took for me, the relationship between myself and the George Mason people, was a lot of talking to make sure that I understood exactly what the study was, what we were measuring, and then how to get that implemented. Because that was the hardest part, was thinking about, okay, if we're going to set this up as a randomized control trial for our hotspots. This study was based on the 1995 Minneapolis hotspot study that was done by Larry Sherman and David Weisberg. And Larry was my advisor when I was at the University of Cambridge. So I knew about the hotspot study, and then speaking to David, I learned a lot more. From that study, Chris Koper had extrapolated the data and come up with this theory that 15 minutes of high visibility policing is the optimal amount to reduce crime and calls for service. So that's where we came up with the idea that we should test that and to see if it worked in Sacramento. As I said, we were up against huge budget cuts, and we still wanted to drop crime in our city. So once we decided that that was our study and our framework for that, what we had to do is get my crime analysis unit to come up with analyzing the whole entire city for our crime and calls for service. We used about a year of data for Part 1 crimes and 2 years for calls for service. And then we rank ordered all of the hotspots in the city, and then we came up with about 52 different hotspots. And these are the things that you need to work with researchers very closely, because I don't understand statistical power or sample size. So I made sure that I checked in to say, here's how many hotspots I have. This is how they're going to be randomized. We did a block randomization, which means because our sample size in the end ended up only being 42 hotspots, because we only did 2 districts in our city. because at the time this was new for us to have a very assertive directed patrol for our officers. So instead of overwhelming our whole entire organization, we just chose 2 districts to roll it out in to test the study. So we had the 42 hotspots, and so of those 42, the top 2 were paired and then randomly assigned to treatment or control, and then 3 and 4, 5 and 6, et cetera. We went down the list and paired them and then assigned. And those are the kind of things that I would not have known unless I was talking to researchers to have them explain why it's important to increase your statistical power, why it's important to look at your sample size, and those things. Once we decided what our study was, which the treatment was going to be 15 minutes of high visibility intermittent random patrols. And what that meant for the officers is they would get a list of their hotspots every day that was randomized. So if they had 3 hotspots, one day they could go in order 1, 2, 3. The next day it might be 3, 2, 1. Next day it might be different. It was completely random. And they would go to their hotspots roughly every 2 hours. That was based on Chris's article that the efficacy lasts for approximately 2 hours. And they would go in that random order. We gave them suggestions about what to do in their hotspots. It wasn't about testing exactly what they were doing in the hotspot. It was about testing getting them there and being highly visible. So we told them, you know, if you can make subject stops, traffic stops, business checks, positive police contact, whatever you could do in your hotspot, that's fine. We encourage you to do that, but please just actually get there. And we wanted to measure the effect on crime and calls for service in the area. And we ran the study for 90 days, which is also a short period, but long enough to get us some good results. And we saw when you're comparing the treatment versus control area, so our control area actually got normal patrol policing. So we didn't take away anything in the control area, and the officers were not aware of where the control hotspots were. The only people that knew where the control hotspots were the crime analysis unit. So that way you wouldn't get contamination. Running the study over that 90-day period, we saw a 25% drop in Part 1 crimes and a 7.7% drop in calls for service when you compare the treatment versus control from 2010 to 2011. And when we were doing this study, when we would go out to roll calls and talk to the officers, a lot of their concerns were around they would not be as proactive as they used to be, that it would increase response times to calls for service, that it would displace crime to other areas, and it's not really an effective method. So we made sure at the end, not really, at the end, that we didn't want, it wasn't part of like a serious study. We didn't do it scientifically. We wanted to just make sure we looked at these things at the end. Cody did some analysis of it, but for us in-house, we ran all the numbers to see if their proactivity went down, and it actually didn't. It actually increased their proactivity. If you include the hotspot visits, it increased their proactivity in one district by like 140-something%, and in the other district by 76%. But even taking out the hot spotting, they had still increased their proactivity, which to me is just kind of a benefit. I think when you measure something, then officers start producing more because they know they're being measured. So I think that was one advantage of the study, is that we actually became more productive when we were having decreased officers within the department. And we didn't increase our response times to calls for service. And that was a really big thing, because the officers thought, if I'm at my hotspot, I'm not going to get to calls on time. And if I'm not getting to calls on time, you know, how is that going to affect the citizens? And then on displacement, we looked at displacement as far as the buffer zone around about a 2-block area. And we only saw 2 areas that showed a little bit of displacement, one of which there was a new Target store in, so we attributed that to higher calls for service and Part 1 crimes, because you have a new store, a new area that wasn't there from the year before. So those were the benefits of, or those were the outcomes of the study. Some of the benefits, I think, for the agency was, like my unit as far as crime analysis, they got a really good understanding of what science looks like and why rigorous evaluation is really important. Because before, as I said, often we implement a program and we really don't have a good understanding of proper evaluation. So I think they got an idea of how to use science, why statistics matter so much, even though most of us hate them, and nobody told us that when you signed up to be a cop that there was going to be math. But this is actually becoming one of the most important areas of policing is using research and using math to understand whether or not we're effective. And this also, if your organization chooses to do this, you're adding to the body of the research for the policing profession. So I consider that like your pro bono work, because researchers and universities are constantly trying to create experiments, to create studies, to do to analyze data so they could help us be better cops. For us as the police profession, if every single police organization that had over 1,000 cops did one study, you would be closing our gap of knowledge in a matter of, you know, years, 5 years as compared to 10. I mean, of course, there's always things you're not going to know and that you're going to study, but if every police organization actually participated in contributing to that body of research, we would make huge strides in our knowledge of what we do if what we do works. And it also gives you in-depth analysis of your organizational problems or issues. I didn't realize this was a very big learning curve for me. I didn't have any experience in running a research study or research design or any of this. I had a little bit of knowledge about what was out there in the field, but not much. And I learned afterwards by setting up the research design ahead of time. You have this huge body of data that you can now delve into that could tell you all kinds of things about your organization. For us, one of the things we pulled was our AVL data, and you could look at how much time your officers are actually spending in the hotspot and how much does that affect crime and calls for service in your area or where your cops are really going. You could look at the arrest that you made, if that was different for one hotspot to another hotspot. You could look at calls for service, if it affected one type of call for service but not another. There's all of this information to be had if you set up the design in the beginning. And that's talking to a couple different organizations, and they're deciding to start doing things like this, is I encourage them to just set it up in the beginning, because one of the things you can do is if you set up a good research design in the beginning, even if you don't have a partner yet, if you have somebody that will guide you through the process, there's going to be some grad student or some university or some researcher that would be so happy if in a year you're able to give them all this data about some specific problem in policing. And they'll take it on because they want to do the analysis, they want to be published, they want to look at these things. And it could, you know, for your department, to me it gains a little notoriety to be recognized as a leader, you know, in innovation, that you're leading the way when it comes to police research and you're contributing to that body of knowledge. And then it also, by developing that partnership with a university, I sat in on a BJA meeting and they were discussing the issues they were having with giving out grants and the relationship not being established first, as they were running into problems because the research didn't start smoothly or it didn't end in the amount of time that the grant was dedicated for. And they wanted to see partnerships that were actually very solid before they gave grant funding. And I think if you're working on some projects together that you could do on your own without outside funding, well, that builds you towards showing that relationship where you can get some outside funding. And I think that's pretty much, there's a lot more benefits, but I think that's the rest of it. Oh, and the challenges. Okay. So the challenges. with the study, what I would recommend, my staff ran the majority of the study. We had support from our chief and my captain that ran, that oversaw our crime analysis unit. I think when you're trying to get an organization to move forward with something like evidence-based policing or any new type of policing that they're not used to, it should come from really strongly from your executive management and not peer-to-peer. When you have peer-to-peer, so like myself as a sergeant of crime analysis, working with sergeants out in patrol to get officers to engage in hotspot policing, there's going to be issues because we both have different goals. And even though the organization knows that as a priority you're doing this research study, it still becomes, you know, the patrol sergeant has to accomplish their goals on a day-to-day basis that might not be congruent with the goals of someone else. And that's where I think for us, when you look back at how you roll something out, we probably should have had our executive command more involved and had that at a higher level than just myself and my team. And don't get me wrong, they were fully supportive. I just think it's more of creating a team that is from all components of your police department. So if I was to do it again, I would say that research team should be involved your patrol sergeants, your crime analysis sergeant, probably a patrol lieutenant, someone in your executive command staff, as high as a captain or even a deputy chief to check in on things. With your chief, of course, being, you know, your innovation champion, making sure that they're fully supportive of it. But I think that the team should be more well-rounded when rolling out something like this, because with any type of organizational change, you're always going to get some pushback, and I think it's better to have a lot of different people involved to get their views on it and get their feedback in how to get the organization to keep moving. And then also, you know, the experience of both police versus researchers is researchers have a ton of experience as far as working with agencies across the United States, where police, our experience is a lot more narrow. So sometimes you have a conflict there of police with knowing our area, relying on our intuition and relying on our experience, where researchers tend to rely on hard data. So sometimes there's a clash there of getting, you know, for both sides to understand, one, where we're coming from as cops, and then two, for us to understand what the data actually means when it comes back to us. And that was the one thing when we were setting up the study that Cynthia Lum had discussed. The 90-day time frame was short, but it was also that kind of time period where the officers wouldn't get too bored, because what you don't want is to have the integrity of your study breaking down because the officers stop engaging in it. And then, you know, that you have enough resources to actually do a study, that you have the staffing, the technology, the time, and the funding. Like I said, you could do it. I think you could do a lot of things without funding. If you want something more expansive or more detailed, you're probably going to have to look at some funding sources, like the BJA Smart Policing Initiative, the NIJ grants. But for the most part, I think if you create a good partnership with a university, you could design some really good in-house research and some good in-house studies, as long as you have the staffing, the technology, and the time.
Yeah, just to jump on what Renee was saying, in terms of resources, as we said, I mean, we were able to complete this experiment without any outside funding. And a real benefit is that police agencies are typically collecting a lot of data already on calls for service, crime incidents, arrests, complaints. There's lots of data sources the police department has that could be useful in designing research. And something that, because we didn't have a federal grant, we couldn't do some things, like if we wanted to get a better sense of what officers were doing in the hotspots using ride-alongs or observations or other site visits. We didn't have the resources to pay people to do that. So sometimes federal grants can be really useful. As Renee was saying, you know, smart policing grants are one way that the federal government has invested a lot in some of these police practitioner and researcher partnerships. There's now about 30 agencies working in smart policing on trying to think about ways to use place-based policing, evidence-based approaches to tackle some chronic problems that these agencies are having. And these federal grants can be really useful, especially in doing things that involve kind of a better understanding of what officers are doing on the street or surveying citizens about their views about the police. So resources are always, and money is always helpful, right? But there's a lot of things you can do without big federal grants, and there's a lot of ways that police can do some of these evaluations with existing resources.
Great. Thank you, panelists. At this point, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. And again, if you'd like to ask a question, you have two options. You can ask a question verbally over the phone by clicking on the hand icon on your control panel there. I will then call on you, unmute you, and you can ask your question that way. Or you can also submit a question through the question box that's also on your control panel. If you type that in, I will read those questions to the panelists. So if you have anything you'd like to ask, now's the time to do so. And I thought just while we're waiting for a question, panelists, for you, I did have a question myself, just in terms of possibly Renee, have you spoken to any other policing agencies at this point about conducting similar research in their agencies, such as a hotspots policing study? And if so, what sort of outcomes have you seen so far? Have people actually taken this on yet? Or?
Yeah, actually, so this last year, well, there's quite a few agencies. Portland's discussing, police bureau is discussing implementing a hotspot study and attempting to get a grant to look at expanding the hotspot study that I did and looking at deploying at off-peak hours rather than at your peak hours to look at, and like I said, it's all about trying to figure out what works for you and your organization, because they're looking at the same kind of budget cuts that we are, but trying to see if you could still be effective when your officers actually have the free time, rather than the way we do it now, which is hotspotting at your peak hotspot hours, to see if that efficacy would carry over. That's one example. Another one, last year, Riley County, Kansas, their captain came down to the George Mason Symposium, and he went back after sitting in on the symposium for the 2 days, and he and I discussed the hotspot study. He went back and created a partnership with his local university, and I believe their hotspot study that they set up was looking at the difference between if you need to be really proactive in the hotspot or if you just need to be highly visible. Because the idea there is twofold, is if you could just be highly visible without being, and I don't like to use aggressive, but without using aggressive police tactics, can you still reduce crime and calls for service, which for police agencies that have a poor relationship with their community, they could engage in this type of policing without harming their community while they repair the relationship, if it shows to be effective. Or, on the other hand, if it shows that you need to be very proactive in your hotspot, you need to be making traffic stops, subject stops, giving citations, etc., then you have some evidence to show that when you are hotspotting, you need to be proactive in those areas. So those are just a couple examples I could think of off the top of my head.
Great, thank you. It looks like we've had 2 questions submitted through the question box. One actually came from Cynthia Lum. It looks like we may need to update one of the links that we had listed for the upcoming symposium at George Mason University. And I should mention that we are recording this webinar so that we can archive it on the International Association of Chiefs of Police website. So when we do that, we'll make sure that we have the current links up there as well so people can access those. We have another question here from Terry Hines. It looks like she asks, so how long did the planning stage take? And then she has a follow-up question, how many people worked on the data? And that's to either panelist.
So the planning stage was actually fairly quickly for us, and it worked out fine. I don't know that I would recommend going as fast, because now that I've done one study, like, I have a better understanding of things that go wrong and the flaws and the errors. Because I would say it was the end of November when we started discussing it, and our plan was actually to roll it out the beginning of January, and it just so happened my appendix decided to explode in the middle of that, and we pushed it back to February. So that was only 2 months of planning before we actually rolled it out. I would say if I was to go back, I would have spent more time with the officers. creating that committee, and I know a lot of times people think a committee slows things down, but really getting people's buy-in, looking for my opinion leaders in the organization, and maybe having them on the committee to get buy-in, because really if you're doing a study, somehow you're changing your organizational culture, and when you start in that process, it's difficult to get them moving in that direction. And so, and Cody, I think maybe for you, you could talk about the data.
Yeah, I mean, primarily I was looking after the experiment. I was working with Renee, and I don't know, Renee, how many folks were working with the data in crime analysis, but I was primarily working on the data at George Mason with sort of David Weisberg sort of also overseeing kind of what we were doing to analyze it. And then we had a number of people, Cynthia Lum among them, Chris Cooper, David Wilson here at George Mason, others that kind of took a look at our, after we had put together the results, kind of be sure that we had done things properly. But the kind of the good thing about the way we designed the experiment, because these hotspots were paired, the actual analyses, the actual statistical analysis isn't particularly complicated, just because we were able to take advantage of randomization, allowing us to make causal inferences, and because they were paired, we were able to largely t-test something else.
And on our end for the data, it was really Jason Rohde, one of my crime analysts. He was responsible for doing all the analysis as far as figuring out where the hotspots were. And he and I would just go back and forth about what made a hotspot. So we went off the 1995 study as to how we developed the hotspot. And then he kept track of everything, just because my feel on that was if I had more people involved with the data, there's a bigger chance for us messing something up, because he had his exact technique, so every time we pulled data, he pulled it the same way. So I think that kept our data a lot cleaner and a lot more like integrity, that we knew for sure that we were grabbing the right stuff every time.
Great. Thank you. We have another question here from Jim Sheehan. He asks, did you find that hotspots migrated to new locations?
And no, that's where the displacement that I was talking about, that we really didn't see any displacement. I know David had actually done a lot of work around displacement, showing that it's not, you actually get a diffusion of benefits to the areas outside. And Cody could probably speak to this more than I can about the research that's out there about displacement and where it goes, but we didn't see it in our particular study.
In terms of, I guess, post-intervention, we were essentially, because of the nature of the intervention, which was really high visibility 15-minute stops, we assumed that most of our crime control benefits would come during the intervention. So in our data analysis, they're looking at the 90-day experiment versus the same time period in the prior year. And so what we haven't done that might be interesting to do, actually, Renee, would be to look more at sort of where are the hotspots, 3, 6, 9 months after. I mean, we assumed that we'd probably quickly see a decay in any crime control benefit, but we could see sort of whether these hotspots would remain consistent after treatment's removed or whether new ones had popped up. But Renee's right, in terms of displacement outcomes, we didn't see, as she mentioned, the overall, there were a few hotspots that seemed to have some displacement. One was a target site, and one was a hotspot that didn't respond very well to treatment overall, so we didn't think that was actually a displacement case. But there wasn't a lot of evidence that what Sacramento was doing was just pushing crime to places nearby. But displacement, is always tricky to mention. So whether we potentially could have pushed offenders from one part of the city to another is much harder to measure. But there didn't seem to be, small-scale displacement in areas surrounding. But in terms of the long-term outcomes, we haven't. It's not something we really assessed here, but it'd be interesting.
Okay. And that's the other thing that, like I was saying before, when you do the research design up front, there's all that data is still there. You could go back in, you could look at those things. I mean, there's so many things you could go back in and look at that to me, it's really nice as a police agency that if you have questions or ideas about what works and what doesn't work, is you could dive back in and say, okay, I think, this is my hypothesis. I think this is why there was displacement. And you could go in and you could look deeper.
Great. It looks like we have one last question here from Terry Hines again. How did you use specialized units in the hot spots area?
We didn't. And like I said at the beginning, the whole idea for us was just to use patrol, because we were going to be cut so severely. We didn't have specialized units, and we wanted to. And we actually, I left out. We cut our motor team, so we didn't have a motor team out in the street. We didn't have pop teams. We didn't have any of those teams that you normally would send to a hotspot. And what the other objective for us was, that I didn't mention earlier, is we wanted to see if we could do this on what we had. So instead of, some studies, when you get funding for it, you give, all this overtime to the officers to implement the treatment. For us, we wanted to see if we could implement the treatment without extra specialty units, without extra overtime. And the thought was, these are just small increments of time during an officer's day. It's 15 minutes. So can they, during their normal daily activities between calls for service, can they get to their hotspots often enough for 15 minutes to reduce crime and calls for service? And what we showed is, yeah, they did.
Great. Well, thank you, panelists. I don't see any other questions at this point. So I think we're probably going to go to conclude our Q&A. Cody, if you just advance it to the next slide. I did want to ask, though, panelists, do you have any other final comments that you'd like to make before we close the webinar today?
No, I think that's about it.
Yeah, feel free to contact us if you have further questions about anything.
Yes, definitely.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both today for your contributions to this webinar, and I also want to thank our audience members for their participation. We are including contact information, as Cody and Renee mentioned, for each of our panelists, as well as ISB staff, should any of the audience members have questions following this webinar. I should also mention that there will also be a brief survey that should pop up once the webinar ends, and we just ask that you take a moment to provide us some feedback on today's event. We just want to thank you all again, and stay safe out there.